As you may recall, our summer series has been Jesus Desires to Feed Us. And I think it's a great theme that fits so well with the readings that we get for these 5 weeks. It's called the Bread of Life Discourse from the Gospel of John. And it's a great discourse because Jesus is mapping it out as clear as he could be. If you recall, a couple of weeks ago, Jesus was able to feed the multitudes. He took a couple of loaves of bread and fed 5,000. And because they got fed, they started to follow him everywhere, but they didn't know why they were following him. And so last week, Jesus says, "You were only looking for more bread." But then we had to talk about how we need to be more receptive to the bread that Christ gives. We ourselves have to be properly disposed. Otherwise, the bread that we receive could actually become death. If you've ever studied any of the nutrition things, it's a person who's severely malnourished. If you feed them the wrong way, you could actually make them sick or even kill them. They found that out after the death camps when they wanted to feed all of these people who were emaciated. Now we get to this week. And this week, we see this beautiful image in the first reading. There, Elijah is told, you've got to go on a long journey. Take some food, you're going to need it. Ever notice how food shows up so much in the scriptures? It shows up so much in our lives. And the word bread in particular, take this bread, eat, be strong, especially, he's told, be strong, you've got a long journey ahead of you. I don't know if it's ever happened to you where maybe for one reason or another, you've been unable to take a bite to eat, and as the day draws on, you begin to feel weaker and weaker, until you sit down and actually eat something, and then you feel kind of refreshed and alive. That's how Elijah seems to me. He's fading, and he's gone through so much, and he sits down and he says, I wish it were over. But the angel is nudging him and saying, I've got something better for you. Jesus desires to feed us. It's there in front of us. And yet so often we don't pay attention. You know, it's interesting how many of us Christians today really don't know Christ. How many of us say we know him, but he's really not much a part of our life except for a few minutes on Sunday maybe. How much we really don't spend time getting to know him better, of nourishing ourselves with him. How many of us don't recognize the beauty of the Eucharist? How many of us don't appreciate just how wonderful it is to have the Eucharist? How many of us don't appreciate that the culture in which we live is like swimming in garbage because we're fed so much stuff that's bad for us? And yet we still come to the Eucharist and think there's going to be some magic formula that's going to change all of that. We've got to have a bit of an effort in our own lives to get to know Jesus better. Some of the efforts that we can take, the opportunities that are available to us. This church building is open. You can come before the Bread of Life anytime and just lay out your life to him and be fed just by being in his presence. Yet how many Catholics don't take advantage of it? There are churches everywhere you go. I mean, we're fortunate here in the Northeast. You don't have to go far to find the next church. So if not here, find the next one or the next one. If you're working in the city, you can find a church. This church is all over the place. And yet, how empty many of our churches remain. Scott Hahn, the great Dr. Scott Hahn, who was a Baptist preacher and became a Catholic, tells the story in the thing that's on Formed. If you haven't signed up yet for Formed, I highly encourage you to do it. It's no cost to you. Go to our website, and you get all the information you need and signed up. And one of the pieces that are on there is called Presence. And it's a 4-part series, I believe, on the Eucharist itself. It would be perfect this time of year as we're listening to the Bread of Life Discourse. But he talks about his experience of trying to figure out, when he started to study the early fathers, are Catholics really on target with this whole Eucharist thing? Are Catholics really on target? So what he decided to do is to slip into a Catholic chapel. And as he's listening to the words of the Mass, this Bible preacher recognized just how much of the Bible is recited at Mass. Using the Lamb of God, talking about the bread, take this all of you need. He says all of this is biblical. And then it dawned on him And he stayed after the Mass. Everybody went off. And he stayed after and he goes, "There you are before me." And that set him on a journey of conversion, now becoming what I want to say one of the greatest Catholic apologists and evangelists in our midst. He's wonderful to listen to if you haven't heard him. Go and hear that story. Go and hear other stories of conversion. And then I believe we as Catholics begin to see how important it is we not only receive communion, even if it only be once a week, but that we get ourselves right and start to surround ourselves. From the earliest days of the church, we were referred to as the way. Follow the way. The way where? I think that's the part we forget a lot of times. We are people on a journey, like Elijah in the desert, like the redeemed people of Israel who are journeying through the desert. We are on a journey to the kingdom. We're on that journey, and Jesus desires to feed us on that journey, just like to Elijah. No, get up and take this. You need this sustenance for the journey. For our spiritual journeys, we need the Eucharist. We need it to be coming into a spirit and a soul properly disposed, as we heard last week, but also to remember that as a people on the journey, there's food for that journey to help us along the way. Just like when we don't eat properly and when we've missed a few meals, our bodies start to wilt a little bit, so too our spirits. It's interesting, so many people have forgotten the word viaticum. The church had always talked about viaticum. If someone's on their deathbed, you bring them the Eucharist. The priest anoints them and then gives them the Eucharist because viaticum meant food for the journey. From the journey from this life finally to the next. Of having that spiritual food one last time as someone goes off to be with God. That, my dear brothers and sisters, is a word I hope all week long you use for yourself. Food for the journey. We look at our lives, and sometimes our lives are filled with a lot of stuff. We go through a lot of things, some good, many bad. So often we're being beat up spiritually. We're being beat up psychologically. We're being beat up because the world is not being kind to us. And little do we realize that in the midst of all of that, there's Jesus saying, "Let me feed you so you can be strong. Let me be your all. Let me be there with you." And then there's the Eucharist. Maybe we should spend a little more time before the Blessed Sacrament, just recognizing his presence in the Eucharist. I believe, for me, has helped me to appreciate just every time I encounter Jesus when I leave this building. Every time I encounter him in another person. Every time another cross is thrust upon me and I see him there with me. He is there for us and he desires to feed us and strengthen us. But we have to do our part. We have to open ourselves up to him. We have to receive him with a pure heart, with a gracious heart. We have to come to the Eucharist today aware of our own brokenness. And what does he want to do with that brokenness? He wants to make it whole. He wants to make it holy in both senses of the word. He wants us all to be holy. He wants us all to be filled with his grace. He desires to feed us. But we have to be desired to be fed. I remember when I was a child and all those times my mother beat it into my head. There are certain foods that you eat and certain foods that you don't eat at the proper times. You don't eat the cookies before dinner. At dinner you have to eat your vegetables, even though I didn't really want to. We learned as young children how to care for our bodies, but also too, my mother taught me how to care for my soul. And she taught me, I remember going over the act of contrition with her before my first reconciliation, and her helping me to memorize it, and then taking me to confession on a regular basis thereafter, so that I would learn the value of being a good person, of turning away from sin and being filled with grace and being converted, so that when I received the food for the journey, I was properly disposed and ready to receive it, and I got stronger. I recall those days when I didn't have the Eucharist in my life and how dark they sometimes seemed. I hadn't realized it until I drifted so far, and then God woke me up again. And just like Scott Hahn, I could say, there I looked at it and I said, there he is. There's my Lord. There's my God. And now I say to you too, Jesus is before you. He wants you to be holy. He wants your life to be different than the rest of the world. Today, my dear brothers and sisters, he desires to feed you with his own body and blood. He desires to feed you with his divinity. He desires to grace you in such a way that you become a living disciple in this world, a living tabernacle in this world, going forth and letting the whole world know there is good food. Jesus is the bread of life, and that which we receive from the altar is that bread that gives life to our souls, that invigorates our souls, that makes you and me people strong for the journey, the way to the kingdom. And I hope to be bringing a whole bunch of people with me on that journey. And I hope you want to be with me on that journey. And in the end, I hope you bring a lot of people with you on that journey. Viaticum, food for the journey, is what we will receive today. Viaticum, not on our deathbed even though we are dying, but today to be fed with food that comes down from heaven, the bread of life, the bread that comes from heaven, Jesus Christ himself. May God fill you with his grace this day and fill you and your family with his blessings this week as you accept this food and grow in strength and holiness. God bless you.